forces before finishing his journey with roughly 11 ships, 500 men, and 13 horses. He then anchored in Tabasco in February of 1519 and was then headed by the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II to the capital of Tenochtitlan, due to the emperor's belief that Cortez may be the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, who was prophesied to return that year. Emperor Montezuma treated Cortez as an honored guest, completely unaware of his true intentions, or the fact that the conquistador had kindled many new friendships and found local allies who were unsatisfied with the Aztec rule throughout his quest to Tenochtitlan. Cortez saw his chance and jumped on it, taking the emperor himself hostage and commanding a raid of the capital city, which housed over 140,000 inhabitants. While Cortez was leading his so far successful incursion, he got news of another Spanish expedition on its way from Cuba, led by Panfilo Narvaez, to arrest Cortez. This was for sailing to Mexico without Governor Diego Velasquez's support and end his conquest. Cortez refused to be stopped and decided to leave the city temporarily to face Narvaez head-on, leaving Pedro de Alvarado and a few hundred soldiers, a combination of Spanish and Tlaxcaltecs, to maintain control of Tenochtitlan until his return. Unfortunately, Alvarado decided to handle things with extreme measures and massacred some of the empire's chiefs, sparking a vicious rebellion from the Aztec troops. When Cortez returned, he and his troops were forced to retreat as the Aztecs triumphantly fought back. Although the Spaniards managed to kill Emperor Montezuma, they lost most of the progress they had made before the retreat. In one night, the Spaniards are believed to have lost around half of their forces on what is now known as the Night of Sorrows. Those who managed to escape were wounded and plagued with exhaustion, as well as having lost their cannons along with their men. Most of their gunpowder was also spent, and they were lucky to find a friendly province, Tlaxcala, to recuperate. Meanwhile, the Aztecs' new emperor, Cuitlahuac, was in no mood to forgive and forget. Instead, he brought together as many soldiers as he could to create a highly numbered army under the command of his brother, Matla-Sin-Cutzin, and sent them off to crush the Spaniards one final time. The worn-down remainder of Cortez's troops met with the Aztecs at the Valley of Otumba, either or near July 7th of 1520. While the Aztecs profoundly outnumbered Cortez and his army, the Spanish were experienced veterans and had notably more superior armor and weaponry. Still, the Aztecs seemed to take the upper hand early on into the conflict. Cortez was unwavered by this, though, and concocted a new dangerous yet genius plan. After catching sight of Matla-Sin-Cutzin and his generals thanks to their brightly colored apparel, the Spaniard gathered his most highly skilled horsemen, Alonso de Avila, Cristobal de Olid, Juan de Salamanca, Pablo de Sandoval, and Pedro de Alvarado, and made a sudden rush toward the Aztec captains. The latter were completely bewildered, and the surprise sent Matla-Sin-Cutzin stumbling, giving Juan de Salamanca the chance to strike him down with his lance. The Spaniards turned the tide of the battle in their favor, and the Aztec army, now without command, retreated. Although the unexpected and quite frankly miraculous victory was remarkably important for the Spanish conquistadors, it still left Cortez himself severely wounded, and some of his men dead. When they returned to Tlaxcala once again to rest and recover, Cortez fell into a coma for a few days, while his men awaited their next mission. Nonetheless, by mid-August 1521, the Spaniards retook Tenochtitlan and officially toppled the Aztec Empire. Cortez was now able to begin colonizing Mexico, which he named Nueva España, or New Spain. By 1547, the Spaniards dominated the majority of what had once been the Aztec empires, whilst they enslaved the indigenous people who did not already die from the deadly diseases the conquistadors had brought with them. It is estimated that by 1605, roughly 24 million natives had been killed by such diseases. The Spanish had also began to convert the locals to Catholicism as early as 1523, when missionaries arrived in New Spain. The building of churches and monasteries began, as the Catholic Church started to gain an influence over the region. After a couple of centuries, the Catholic Church's impact on New Spain continues to grow. Spain's contemporary king, King Carlos III, became concerned about their increasing power in the colony. His main criticism was aimed at the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits had gradually expanded their influence in New Spain as they evangelized the indigenous people and worked to educate the elite class of Criollo, which were Spaniards born in the colony. King Carlos was unwilling to risk losing the crown's hold over the region and expelled 678 Jesuits from New Spain in 1767 and sent them into exile in Italy. Many of the locals, both indigenous and criollos, were angered by the king's decision, adding on to the already lengthening list of complaints against Spain from their colony. Still, the first sign of weakness from the colonizing nation only came in 1808, when Napoleon Bonaparte entered the picture. The eruption of the Peninsular War in the Iberian Peninsula distracted the Spanish from some of their outward endeavors, as Napoleon attempted to occupy both Spain and Portugal in response to a Portuguese refusal to cut off trade with the British and issue a declaration of war. Although Spain and France had been allies since 1796, in the fall of 1807, Bonaparte ordered 30,000 men to march through Spain and into Portugal, and seemed to throw out any notion of remaining loyal to his Iberian ally. When the French troops took Portugal, they also began to occupy parts of northern Spain, forcing King Charles IV of Spain to attempt to leave the country, just as his Portuguese counterparts had done, fleeing to Brazil before the French could capture them. The king's escape was interrupted by revolutionaries known as the Ferdinandista faction, who forced Charles to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand VII. While Charles was busy dealing with this obstacle, Napoleon seized his chance to take Madrid and sent General Joaquin Murat to do just that. Using both bribery and intimidation, Bonaparte was then able to get Charles and Ferdinand to attend conferences in Bayonne, during which Ferdinand abdicated in favor of Charles, who then gave the throne up to Napoleon on May 5th, 1808. Napoleon agreed to allow Spain to stay an independent Roman Catholic nation, and placed it under the rule of his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. At this point, the Spanish began a steady fight for independence, which continued to distract their focus and involvement from New Spain, where tensions continued to rise. On September 16, 1810, a Catholic priest from the town of Dolores in New Spain Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla called for a rebellion against their colonizers. His demand became known as Grito de Dolores, or the Cry of Dolores, after reading it aloud in the town for all to hear. This kicked off the Mexican War of Independence, all while Spain was still locked in Napoleon's Peninsular War. Thousands of indigenous men and mestizos, those of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, answered Hidalgo's call, and a populist army was formed. Initially, the priest's mission was a failure, as he and his rebels were defeated at Calderon in January of 1811 after attempting to take the capital. Though they had captured some cities along their way to the capital, Hidalgo himself faced a gruesome end in a short matter of time. Following an attempt to flee further north into the United States, the rebel was captured, stripped of his priesthood, and executed by firing squad. Still, the people of New Spain were far from finished. Another revolutionary priest, José María Morelos y Pavón, teamed up with a former Spanish royalist army general, Agustín Iturbide, in addition to other rebel leaders such as Vicente Guerrero. When a new liberal government came to power in Spain as of 1820, they attempted to settle the revolution and appease their colony with new reforms, but the conservative portion of New Spain was unsatisfied with the new plan and joined the call for independence. The following year, Agustín de Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero authored the Plan of Iguala, which would establish the colony's independence and create a new constitutional monarchy. The new, independent Mexico would also remain aligned with the Roman Catholic Church and treat the Spaniards born in Mexico as any other Spaniard. Indigenous Mexicans, or those of mixed descent, would not have equal rights or privilege, however. The remaining royalist forces who opposed the revolution were finally defeated, and the new Spanish viceroy was put in a difficult position. Being devoid of any necessary resources or even troops he required to refuse, the viceroy, Juan de O'Donoghue, signed the Treaty of Cordoba on August 24, 1821. This treaty recognized Mexican independence and confirmed the formation of a constitutional monarchy. When no ruler of Bourbon blood could be found, Iturbide was crowned the first emperor of Mexico instead. Iturbide's reign was short-lived, though, and Antonio López de Santa Anna, alongside Guadalupe Victoria, overthrew the emperor and wrote a new constitution that would replace the empire with a federal republic made up of 19 states and 4 territories. Guadalupe Victoria became the first president, and Antonio López de Santa Anna became a general, most notably known for his successful siege of the Alamo during Texas's War for Independence in 1836. General Lopez and his Mexican troops won the Battle of the Alamo, although Texas would gain independence later that year, which Mexico bluntly ignored until the end of the Mexican-American War that cost them Texas, California, and the Southwest. While General Lopez also spent some time serving as President of Mexico, he was eventually exiled after multiple times been so before, and was unable to return until shortly before his death in 1876. By this point, France had already occupied Mexico for a short time before leaving in 1867, and Porfirio Diaz became a new, controversial president in the 1870s. His dictatorship led to the Mexican Revolution in 1910, triggering a civil war costing roughly 2 million lives. Finally, beginning in 1934, the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas brought much-needed stability and development for the nation. Today, although Mexico still has its struggles and challenges, it is a fully independent country founding member of the United Nations.
Una ira de 205 millones de dólares. 2 noches y días enteros se pasaron estos funcionarios juntando el dinero.
This is the story of how the largest cash bust in the history of the war on drugs didn't actually involve any drugs being recovered at all.
La llamada Operación Dragón, sucedida en el 2007, implicó al empresario chino-mexicano Chen Li Yegon.
¿Opera o cuello?
It's the story of how a Chinese-Mexican businessman went from being celebrated by world leaders to being imprisoned in multiple countries. How Las Vegas casinos used to help cartels launder hundreds of millions of dollars, and of how the drugs we take actually get made. Some stories of the war on drugs are violent, some are tragic, and some are just plain weird. This is the story of Zhenli Yegon. Zhenli Yegon was born in Shanghai in 1963. In the 90s, he moved to Mexico and founded several companies. In particular, the highly successful chemical importer Unimed Pharma. In early August, violence exploded in western Mexico. Roads were blocked, cartel gunmen cruised the streets at will, and in the city of Guanajuato, 25 outlets of a popular convenience store were burned to the ground. This was not a random eruption of violence or a rival crime groups fighting in turn. This was a coordinated operation by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or T.G.E, specifically designed to disrupt an attempt by the Mexican military to arrest two of its bosses. And it worked. The two bosses, known as haHA and haHA, both got away. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel have become known as Mexico's most violent and dangerous drug empire, and the most serious challenger to the mighty Sinaloa cartel. But how have they achieved this? How have they risen from nothing to command a paramilitary-style narco army? And amid rumours that their leader is actually dead, could they be about to disintegrate into chaos? Like many modern cartels, the T.G.E got their start with the destruction of another older cartel. The Millennial Cartel was founded back in the 1970s by the Valencia crime family in Michoacan. By the early 2000s, they'd grown to become major allies of the Sinaloa cartel, particularly notorious for their role in the crystal meth trade.
The Millennium Cartel used to be one of the most financially powerful cartels in Mexico.
But in 2009, the leader of the Millennial Cartel was captured, and in 2010, the local Sinaloa boss was killed by Mexican special forces. This led to a splintering of the Millennial Cartel into rival factions.
The Millennium Cartel split over, and one of those splitters was Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the T.G.E.
Las casas pues ya no son las mismas, todas están balanceadas. Antes aquí es donde estaban los Jaliscos, esto era la barricada de ellos, todo esto. Pero quizás aquí tenían unos 20 pistoleros, a lo mejor dos aquí, dos allá, pero se tienen que estar rolando, ¿verdad?
This is where Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, or El Mencho, comes onto the scene. wars between Mexico and the US. He married into the Valencia family, creating an alliance that would eventually grow into what became the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
The economical power behind Cartel Jalisco.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies. Another year, another UN General Assembly, and another occasion when I stand before you to address the same issue, the conflict in the Middle East. And not for the first time, developments on the ground have made me question the worth and utility of words in capturing the magnitude of the crisis, yet not speaking about it would signal acceptance of the situation and abandonment of our humanity. And that I will not do. Our UN General Assembly was born 80 years ago, pledging to learn from, not repeat, history. The world vowed never again. However, for almost as long,
If and when the United Nations Security Council and this great assembly decide Indonesia is prepared to deploy 20,000 or even more of our sons and daughters to help secure peace in Gaza or elsewhere. It is indeed a great honor for me to stand in this August General Assembly Hall among leaders and representatives who represent almost all of humanity. We differ in race, religion, and nationality, yet we gather together today as one human family. We are here first and foremost as fellow human beings, each created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words of the United Nations Declaration of Independence have inspired democratic movements across continents, including the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and Indonesia's own struggle and journey to freedom. It also gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. All men are created equal was the creed that opened the way to unprecedented global prosperity and dignity. And yet, in our own era of scientific and technological triumphs, an era capable of ending hunger, poverty, and environmental ruin, we also continue to face today grave dangers, challenges, and uncertainties. Human folly, fueled by regard for international law and human decency. In the face of these challenges, we must not give up. As the United Nations Secretary General said, we cannot give up. We cannot surrender our hopes or our ideals. We must grow closer, not drift apart. Together we must strive to achieve our hopes, our dreams. The United Nations was born from the ashes of the Second World War that claimed scores of millions of lives. It was created to secure peace, security, justice, and freedom for all. We remain committed to internationalism, to multilateralism, and to every effort that strengthens this great institution. Today, Indonesia is nearer than ever before to meeting the sustainable development goals of ending extreme poverty and hunger. Because years ago, this very chamber chose to listen and uphold social and economic justice. We will never forget. And today, we must never be silent while Palestinians are denied that same justice and legitimacy in this very hall.
That's how you have.
Excellencies,
I'm a slut.
Tukidides
Fucking Negroes, man.
warned
Fucking
the
Negroes,
strong
man.
do what they can, the weak suffer what they must.
No, I'm staying home all day doing nothing.
This
Watching
doctrine.
people sleep.
The United Nations exists to
Fucking
reject this
Negro.
doctrine. We must stand
Fucking
no
low
all,
class fucking
the
human
strong
being.
and the
Fucking
weak.
low class fucking female.
Might cannot be right. Right
What a
must be
Negro.
right. Indonesia today is one of the largest contributors to United Peacekeeping Forces. We believe in the United Nations. We will continue to serve where peace needs guardians, not with just words, but with boots on the ground. If and when the United Nations Security Council and this great assembly decide Indonesia is prepared to deploy 20,000 or even more of our sons and daughters to help secure peace in Gaza or elsewhere, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Libya, everywhere when peace needs to be enforced, peace needs to be guarded, we are ready. We will take our share of the burden, not only with our sons and daughters, we are also willing to contribute financially to support the great mission to achieve peace by the United Nations. standard by history. We are all hopeful that the leaders of the world will show great statesmanship, great wisdom, restraint, humility, overcome hate, overcome suspicion. Madam President, distinguished delegates, we are greatly heartened by the events of the last few days, where significant leading countries of the world have chosen to side with history, to choose the right side of history, the path of the moral high ground, the path of rectitude, the path of justice, the path of humanity, to shun hatred, to overcome suspicion, and to avoid the use of violence. The use of violence will beget violence. No one country can bully the whole community of the human family. We may be weak individually, but the sense of oppression, the sense of injustice has proven in the history of mankind that this sense of injustice, this sense of oppression will unite into a strong force that will overcome this oppression, that will overcome this injustice. To close, I would like to reiterate again Indonesia's complete support for the two-state solution in Palestine. We must have an independent Palestine, but we must also recognize, we must also respect, and we must also guarantee the safety and security of Israel. Only then we can have real peace, and no longer hate, and no longer suspicion. The only solution is this two-state solution. Two descendants of Abraham must live in reconciliation, peace, and harmony. Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, all religions, we must live as one human family. Indonesia is committed to being part of making this vision a reality. Is this a dream? Maybe, but this is the beautiful dream that we must work together towards. Let us work towards this noble goal. Let us continue humanity's journey of hope, a journey started by our forefathers, a journey that we must complete. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Now you talk about Toyota. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my days. All my days.
There was once a wing of the Democratic Party that stood up for the war industry. Dave William Fulbright, George McGovern, G. McCarthy, Mike Gravel, William Proxmire, of course Dennis Kucinich. But that was largely decades ago. The new Democrats, especially with the presidency of Bill Clinton, became shills, not only for corporate America, but the arms industry. No weapons system is too costly. No war, no matter how military budget, $850 billion of military spending allocated for fiscal year 2023 is an increase of $45 billion over the Biden administration's budget request and nearly $80 billion more than the amount appropriated by Congress for the current fiscal year. It just keeps growing. When 30 members of the party's Progressive Caucus recently issued a call for Joe Biden to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, they were forced by the party leadership and a warmongering media to back down and rescind their letter. What happened to the Democratic Party? Why has it become impossible to question the war and the massive expenditures on arms? Why is such questioning political suicide? Why can't a Democrat ask, especially at a time of economic hardship and huge deficits, how much we are going to divert to the war in Ukraine, which has already consumed some $60 billion, as much as we spend on the State Department and AID, with no end in sight? Joining me to discuss the extinction of the anti-war Democrat is Dennis Kucinich, a former presidential candidate who served 8 terms in the House of Representatives before the Democratic Party gerrymandered his district to ensure his defeat. Dennis, you were consistently one of the very few Democrats who harkened back to that great era of those I mentioned, McGovern, B. McCarthy, and others, Proxmire, who stood up to the war industry. You paid a very heavy political price for that, not only being pushed out of Congress, but even when you were in Congress. I believe you were not allowed to caucus with the Democrats, if I have that correct, courtesy of Pelosi. But let's go back. There was a moment in time when the Democratic Party had fierce peace candidates, anti-war candidates. Of course, 1972, McGovern becomes the nominee. What happened?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity again to show. And I think, this is the perfect show for me to do, because it's not just a matter of having a conversation with the choir. It's about taking the discussion to a higher level to try to describe to people what's actually happening, what can happen. With respect to the Democratic Caucus, though, I found my way into the meetings.
Uninvited?
Because there wasn't really an attempt to shut me out as much as it was, who brought this guy in. But really, I will say this about Speaker Pelosi, that we may have had a difference of opinion on some of these spending issues that helped to fuel wars. But the thing that I always did was I always let the leadership know ahead of time, I don't agree with you, I'm taking a different approach, I'm going to go to the floor, this is what I'm going to say, whether you like it or not. And they appreciated the warning. They didn't appreciate my speeches. I'm sure didn't appreciate my votes for the most part. But to me, what's happened with the Democratic Party, I think as soon as the Democratic Party made a determination, could have been 35, 40 years ago, that they were going to take corporate contributions, that wiped out any distinction between the two parties. Because in Washington, he or she who pays the piper, plays the tune. And that's what's happened. So there isn't that much of a difference in terms of the two parties when it comes to war, except notably, partisan reasons or not, there were over 50 Republicans who voted against the last tranche of money that went to fuel the war in Ukraine. And I felt that was notable. And of course, the potential Speaker of the House, should the Republicans win, will be Kevin McCarthy, who has made it a point to say that he's going to look at that funding.
Well, let's talk about the past. So you had significant opposition to the Pentagon budget, weapons systems were questioned. Was it in essence corporate money that was a factor in essentially driving Wellstone, driving these figures out of the House and the Senate, or were there other reasons?
Certainly plays a part. I mean, let's face it, right now, the arms industry is making money hand over fist with the expansion of war. That's how they make their money. And of course they can put money into certain campaigns, but that's not all it's about. The request to fund a war goes into the larger, heavily mediated environment which supports a war. And if you stand against the funding, then your constituents who may be great Americans look at that and they say, well, why aren't you supporting America? And I think that members of Congress are always concerned about being caught betwixt and between on what their constituents think as opposed to the doubts that they have. And so with respect to the Democratic caucus, this event, a retraction of the letter by a significant caucus within the Democratic Party, is a new benchmark of kind of a slavish obeisance to the status quo within the party, which then supports war, and a majority of Republicans at this point are supporting war. So you have Congress supporting war, and this is the way it's been.
Seymour Bellman writes about the distortion of the economy by the war industry. He points out that one of the crucial tactics that the war industry uses is to diversify where weapons are made. I believe F-35s are made in Vermont, and this really ties the hands of House and Senate members because it becomes at a constituent level a debate about jobs.
Well, it is a factor. Can't ignore it. So what happens is when the Pentagon budget comes up, there are a parade of various businesses, small and large, who will make appointments with the Congress person or staff and lay out how many jobs are in the district and how important it is to a district business to have this budget passed. I mean, I had that happen to me, and it was, I invariably have to inform my constituent that I didn't support the war that this was going to be fueling, and so I wasn't going to vote for the budget. I will tell you this, Chris, that I may have once, when I first started in Congress, voted for a budget that went to the Pentagon, but it didn't take me long to figure out what the racket was. I had a hearing I went to as a member of the Government Oversight Committee in which an Inspector General testified that there were over $1 trillion worth of accounts in the Pentagon that couldn't be reconciled. That they had over 1,100 different accounting systems, deliberately, I suppose, constructed so as to make obfuscation a rule of the day. So from that moment on, I just said, wait a minute. They're not keeping track of how this money's spent. Why in the world should I vote for this budget? So from that point on, right through the conclusion of a 16-year service in the United States Congress, I didn't vote for a single budget of the Pentagon or any of the supplemental appropriations to keep wars going, because I knew it was a racket. I knew there would be billions of dollars thrown away. And, I could cite chapter and verse, Inspector General's reports. Once the money goes out of this country, overseas, on behalf, whether it's Iraq or whatever adventure we were in, the money's blowing. The thing that I was always concerned about, even more than money, was the fact that we were committing American servicemen and servicewomen, in the case of Iraq, to a lie. And the constituency that I had in Congress, Chris, primarily working class men and women, many veterans halls, people who really believe strongly in America, serve the country themselves or their fathers and grandfathers served, and they support the United States of America. So I'm in Congress and I'm seeing what actually is going on, and I'm going, wait a minute, I'm not a sucker, and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, no, this is wrong. And then I have to go home and explain my vote. And I had some people who were unhappy because they thought I person is supposed to do. But the truth is, the members of Congress are always under enormous pressure, not locally from their constituents, from contractors within their constituency, from the mediated environment, and the party, and so it's a rare individual, and I'm not doing this to elevate myself, but it's a rare individual who will go against that because you risk, at times you may risk your political career.
Well, if you won't take their money, there's always someone else who will, and they will throw a lot of that money at a candidate to take you down.
Well, that's true no matter if you're talking about the arms industry, the oil companies, the healthcare industry. There was a congressional candidate in 1972 who ran against a darling of the AMA, and he told the AMA when they came to him is, look, give the other guy the money because I'm not going to help you. Well, they did, and this young congressional candidate lost a close race. That was me, by the way. So I understand the price that you might have to pay for not going with the crowd, but my feeling is that public office comes and goes. I mean, if who are we if we won't take a stand? Who are any of us if we're not willing to put it all on the line in any given vote and say, look, this isn't only what I believe, and this is who I am. And I'm someone who I don't feel I know more than anybody else. I do my homework, Chris. I make sure that any vote that I take is informed, and as I did when I led the effort against the war in Iraq. And that's not the way it goes in Congress. A lot of people are flying by the seat of their pants, or they look at the vote board to see how everyone else is voting. Because Congress is a place of tremendous peer pressure. And the votes go right up on this, most people don't know this, but the votes are, imagine a big gym, and the votes go up on this big wall, okay? And people, the lights go on, green light for yes, yellow light for I'm not sure, and red light for no. And everybody can see how everybody else is voting. It helps enforce party discipline, and it helps it helps to feed the herd instinct inside Congress. It's a lot of pressure.
Let's talk about the fact of unchecked militarism on our civil society and our democracy.
Well, we live in a time where there's an acceleration of polarized thinking. It's us versus them, whoever they are. And the government helps to feed that. The government generates perceptions, and people think, well, there must be a reason for this for the government's position on this war. The truth of the matter is that we're in a heavily militarized society driven by greed, lust for profit, and wars are being created just to keep fueling that, and it moves right into this idea of this old idea of a manifest destiny, and then you kind of leap into the 21st century, where there are still people who believe, as in the Project for the New American Century, that it has to be that America must rule the world, that it is our destiny. I mean, that is such old thinking, but that's where we are. And we don't always consider that we're inheritors not only of the physical world, but we're inheritors of a consciousness. We're inheritors of thought structures. And the thought structures that we've inherited no longer serve a practical purpose in this country. We move into a false consciousness of fear, of separation from the rest of the world. See, I see the world as one. I think that human unity is the truth that surrounds all of us. And when we start separating ourselves and we engage in this polarized thinking is a precursor of war. And so we need to try to go back to uh, it's really a spiritual principle that says that, look, we're all one. We're interconnected. We're interdependent. And the world is one. We may have different races, colors, creeds, but there's a oneness. And if you look at the first motto of the country, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It's the paradox of unity in multiplicity. And many people can't handle that, but that's the truth. So when we go to war, we live in a lie. We're separating ourselves from part of humanity. It's a belief that we don't have a given ability to be able to solve things, and somehow the power of our weapons is greater than the power of our reason, or even deeper, the power of our heart. And so that's where I've gone away from the orthodoxy, which is now part of politics, and said, well, keep that war going, and for whatever reason, we're going to die, we're going to beat the Russians, we're going to beat the Chinese. What? We're beating ourselves.
To what extent are these conflicts, and I would include the expansion of NATO, driven by this lust for greed on the part of the war industry and the arms manufacturers?
When I was in Congress, I put in legislation to forbid the United States to go in any war that NATO was operating, because I felt that it was subversion of the constitutional principle in Article 1, Section 8, which says the Congress of the United States has the power to take our country from a condition of peace to war. That's in the Constitution. NATO has evolved. It was first a defensive organization. Then, after Clinton, it turned into an offensive organization. And it has become now kind of a sock puppet for Western powers, notably my own dear country, the United States. And as a result, NATO punches above its weight, makes statements that are ridiculous. And look, I will make a prediction right here, that as a result of NATO and the EU's role in helping to fuel this war in Ukraine, give it a couple years, but there won't be a NATO, and there won't be an EU as a result.
Why?
Well, first of all, look at what's happened. The U.S. actually, I think the way this unfolded in Ukraine, we all know from 2014 how the U.S. engineered a coup and knocked out the Ukrainian government, put in one that would serve the U.S. interest, which was to nullify the power of the constituency in eastern Ukraine, which was Russian-speaking. And they wanted to basically, by any means necessary, keep that out of influencing the policies of the region, in which they did. 14,000 by some estimates, Russian-speaking Ukrainians were killed from 2014 until 2021. Most Americans have no idea about that. But anyhow, once the U.S., once the intelligence started to say, hey, we can knock Russia out like that, okay? We'll crush Russia economically. These sanctions are going to put Russia away. And the EU bought into it. What's the result? Well, the war goes on. But in the meantime, the sanctions have created a dramatic increase in the cost of energy. Plus the pipeline, that's another increase in the cost of energy. So I've heard from people in Europe where they're seeing increases in basic energy costs anywhere from 6 to 9 times of what it used to be. Businesses can't survive that. Individuals are under hardship. The pressure is going to go back on the government. This is going to cause a lot of problems with the EU. And NATO is there as, a cat's paw for war. And frankly, people are going to say, well, who's NATO making decisions for me? I would imagine that already you're starting to see protests in Europe where people are saying, get out of the EU, get out of NATO, because they're paying an economic price right now for the misjudgment of the European officials who were coaxed into it by the U.S. And this this ends up being a nightmare, not only for Europe though, but we're getting visited with it somewhat here. You're seeing an increase in food prices, increases in gas prices, the accelerant knock-on effect on inflation. Interest rates have gone up, mortgage rates are gone up. There's a cycle of economic violence which is visited on the people of this country who really don't have a great story about what happened in Ukraine. I represented Ukrainians in the United States Congress, and proudly so. I went to Ukraine. I met with people. I stood in the square in Ukraine in defense of journalists who were under attack there, one of whom was killed, Gonzaga. And so I just felt that, Ukrainians have a right to exist. They have a right to their own country. And what's happened is this is being twisted, and suddenly Ukraine becomes a bloodbath of a chessboard, where these innocent people are just being used as pawns in a game of nations. And I resent that. I mean, I resent that on behalf of every decent person who's trying to keep their family together in Ukraine and who doesn't want to be dominated by anybody, U.S., Russia, anybody, and they just want to live their lives. But because there's a game of nations going on, and the U.S. was concerned about Russia's pivot to Asia, well, guess what? This whole thing is blowing up in the face of the West. Russia's not. We forced Russia to pivot to Asia, and now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. There's a whole new world being formed, and the catalyst of it is the misjudgment that occurred about Ukraine and the effort to try to control Ukraine that began in 2014 that most people aren't aware of, I would say.
Let's talk about the press, because you spoke about going back to your constituents as an anti-war candidate and feeling blowback. But isn't that because essentially we have a press that is locked out anti-war critics?
Well, I think it was a librarian of Congress, Daniel Borston, who wrote a book about the media being spear carriers for the government. And that was true generations ago, and it's true today. And that's a problem. When you don't have when you don't have many alternatives that present a different point of view, you're locked into a worldview that might be based on a falsity. And I'll give you a great example. Go back to Iraq, because I was really involved in that, challenging the narrative right from the beginning. And I did my homework. I saw that back and I gave Congress a memo on October 2nd, 2002, that said, look, there's no proof that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Well, moreover, Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11, with Al-Qaeda's role in 9/11, didn't have the intention or capability of attacking the United States. So what's this about? And I talked to hundreds of members of Congress about it. But the drumbeat in the media, war, 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 from the White House, war, war, war. No one bothered, and this is what so many people heard. It was just drowned out. And so, I've seen this dynamic before. And the media, we have a heavily mediated society, even more so today than 20 years ago. There's